Some names are whispered like secrets, others are sung until the world itself leans in to listen. Tonight we begin with one of those names, a name that carried the weight of song and sorrow, Orpheus. He was not born into power or thrones, not carved into war or crowned by gods, but his gift was sharper than any blade, softer than any prayer. He held a lyre, strings spun with more than gut and wood, strings spun with something closer to breath and heartbeat, and when he played, the world obeyed. Rivers slowed their rush, storms untangled into silence, trees bent as if the sound itself was sunlight. Orpheus was not just a musician, he was proof that the right note could change the world. But every story that begins with wonder must also carry warning, because a song that can soothe the wild can also stir the gods. His name was not spoken in Olympus with joy, but with a wary kind of respect, as if even immortals knew the danger of a mortal who could command the invisible. And so when Orpheus played, the gods listened from above, mortals gathered from below, and even the shadows leaned closer, hoping to hear. His songs were not about conquest or glory. They were about longing, about the ache every heart carried when it searched for someone it had not yet met. And when Eurydice entered his life, that ache became an answer. Eurydice was not a queen, nor a daughter of kings. She was not marked by lightning or prophecy. She was mortal, utterly mortal, and yet her laughter steadied Orpheus's hands in ways no divine blessing could. If Orpheus's music was the fire, Eurydice was the air that kept it alive. Together, they became something whole, something the world had not seen before, a harmony made not of god and mortal, but of two souls finding each other. Their love was simple, but simplicity is what often unsettles the heavens most. The world remembers their names because their story was not just love, but loss. It was not only about holding, but about letting go. And yet, before the tragedy, there was a time when Orpheus's lyre and Eurydice's smile walked the same path, and the earth itself seemed lighter beneath their steps. That time, brief as it was, remains carved into legend. Orpheus was the boy whose song could charm stone, Eurydice, the girl whose presence gave his song its meaning. When you think of heroes, you may think of swords and monsters, of crowns and blood. But tonight, this story reminds us that sometimes the greatest heroism is in love itself, in choosing someone so completely that the whole world bends around that choice. And in that bending, fate begins to stir. So remember this name, Orpheus, because by the end of this tale, you will not just know it, you will feel it, humming in the back of your mind, like a song you cannot stop hearing. This is not just his story, it is theirs. Summer in Greece was a season of noise, festivals bursting with music, wine flowing like rivers, torches blazing against the night. In one of those nights, when the air smelled of figs and smoke, Orpheus was called to play. People crowded the square, voices rising with excitement, yet the moment his fingers touched the strings, silence fell like snow. The lyre spoke, and the festival listened. His music did not chase away the noise, it transformed it, turned shouts into whispers, turned the wildness of celebration into the stillness of awe. The villagers said, They had never heard anything like it. His song painted stories without words, telling of dawns brighter than memory and seas deeper than sorrow. Even the elders, who had long since grown tired of songs, leaned forward, eyes wet with something they had forgotten how to name. Yet somewhere in that crowd stood Eurydice. She had come with friends, laughing as the night began, but as Orpheus played, her steps slowed. She had heard music before, but this was different. It was as if the strings plucked something inside her chest, as if the melody was searching for her and had finally found her. Her friends teased her, but she didn't answer. Her gaze never left him, not once. Orpheus did not notice at first. He had learned to play for audiences, never for faces, because faces faded and voices blurred, but the music stayed. Yet as he played, a shift happened. His fingers moved the same way they always had, but the song was no longer his. It belonged to her. He saw her only in the corner of his vision at first, the way her eyes reflected torchlight, the way her laughter fell silent when the notes reached her. For a moment he faltered, a single string buzzing under his hand, but instead of breaking the moment, it sharpened it. He looked up, truly looked, and the crowd dissolved. There was only her, Eurydice, standing as if the world had stopped moving and left them alone inside it. The song deepened. It became less about beauty and more about truth, less about skill and more about longing. The people around them felt it. They cheered when he ended, begged for more, but neither Orpheus nor Eurydice heard. She stepped forward, unsure if her feet were hers or if the music carried her. He lowered his lyre, heart hammering louder than the applause, and for the first time in his life, Orpheus forgot the music. Eurydice reached him, her smile unguarded, her presence steady. Words were spoken, simple words, lost in the chaos of the crowd, yet they carried more weight than any verse he had ever sung. That night, the festival roared back to life. Dancers spun, firelight sparked, wine spilled, but for Orpheus and Eurydice, the world was smaller. A song had found its silence, and in that silence, something greater was born. Those who were there would later swear they saw it. The exact moment two lives bent toward each other, the melody and its missing note finally becoming one. The sun rose soft that morning, a gold so gentle it seemed to bless the earth itself. Underneath an old olive tree whose roots had held generations, Orpheus and Eurydice prepared to speak vows no priest had written. It was not a wedding wrapped in marble or drenched in wealth. It was a wedding shaped by music and laughter, by wildflowers tied into garlands and friends who stood shoulder to shoulder, smiling because they knew they were standing inside a story worth remembering. Orpheus carried no crown, only his lyre. Eurydice wore no jewels, only the white of her dress and the green of olive branches woven into her hair. And yet no one who gathered thought it plain. The air itself seemed brighter, as if the gods had paused to watch. The villagers whispered that never had they seen such love. When Orpheus sang, he sang not for the crowd but for her, weaving a melody that wrapped around Eurydice like a cloak. The song was soft, steady, carrying not just promises but prayers that time would bend around them and never let them go. She answered not with words but with her gaze, steady and unshaking, as though the whole of Olympus could descend, and still her eyes would not leave his. The people clapped, but some swore they heard something else in the air, faint murmurs not of mortals but of gods, unseen voices carried on the wind. For when mortals find happiness too pure, the divine cannot help but notice. Friends joked that Orpheus had married not a woman but a muse. Others teased Eurydice that she had bound herself to a man who could charm stones but might forget to eat when he played. They laughed, they drank, and they blessed them with olive oil and wine, tokens of plenty and peace. And though the celebration was simple, it carried a weight no temple could match. It was not wealth that made it holy, but love. Yet, in the high places of the world, where clouds veiled marble halls, the gods murmured differently. Some smiled, remembering their own loves lost to time. Others frowned, warning that joy so deep often stirs fate to test it. Zeus himself did not speak, but his silence carried its own kind of omen. Hera tilted her gaze and whispered of fragility. Apollo closed his eyes, hearing a future he would not tell. And somewhere, in the shadows of the fields, something colder stirred, not out of jealousy, but out of the nature of balance. For when the world tilts too much toward light, shadow always finds a way back. Still, for that day, none of it mattered. Orpheus kissed Eurydice beneath the olive branches, and the people cheered until their voices broke. The lyre sang, the earth listened, and even the sky seemed to glow a little longer before night came. It was a beginning wrapped in music and sunlight, a vow spoken not just to each other, but to the world itself. For one perfect moment, happiness was enough, and nothing dared to break it. The day was warm, the kind of day when fields shimmered and bees floated lazily over wildflowers. Eurydice wandered through the meadow, her hands brushing against tall grass, her laughter echoing faintly in the air. She was not running from anything, only savouring the freedom of open space. Orpheus had promised to meet her later with his lyre, and the thought alone made her heart lighter. The meadow seemed alive with colour, petals swaying in rhythm to a wind too gentle to be real. It should have been a moment of peace, but peace is the place where fate often hides. In the tall grass, unseen, something coiled and waiting stirred. A snake, black as shadow, its eyes glinting with the strange awareness of creatures that are sometimes more than they seem. Some said it was chance, the cruel accident of a field alive with life. Others whispered it was envy given flesh, that jealous eyes from the divine had sent it slithering to strike. Whatever the truth, Eurydice did not see it. She stepped lightly, humming a tune Orpheus had once played. The music lingered on her lips, carrying warmth across the meadow. Then it came, sudden as lightning. Fangs flashed, pain seared through her ankle. She gasped, stumbled, and the meadow swallowed her cry. The snake slipped back into the grass, leaving only silence. Eurydice fell among the flowers, her breath quick and shallow, her skin paling as the venom raced through her veins. Her hand clawed at the earth, not out of fear, but as if trying to hold on to the world that was already slipping away. The meadow, so alive only moments before, grew still. Birds quieted, the wind paused, even the sun seemed reluctant to shine too brightly. Eurydice whispered Orpheus's name, but the sound barely left her lips. Her vision blurred, the flowers around her twisting into shapes she could not hold. She thought of him, the music, the vows under the olive branches, and she tried to rise. Her body betrayed her. She collapsed back into the grass, eyes dimming, heart slowing. By the time Orpheus arrived, carrying his lyre and a smile meant only for her, the meadow kept its secret. He found not laughter waiting, but silence. The flowers bent around her body as if they too mourned. His voice broke as he called her name, his hands trembling as he lifted her, as if warmth could be returned by touch alone. But the meadow did not answer. The snake was gone, the whisper of fate already carried elsewhere. And so the world shifted. The wedding song became an elegy. The fields that had once held joy became a grave. Eurydice's story, so bright only hours before, dimmed like a candle in sudden wind. Orpheus clutched her to his chest, and though the world around him remained still, inside him the storm had begun. This was no simple loss. This was the strike of destiny, and destiny had chosen its path. The meadow was still heavy with silence when Orpheus carried Eurydice back. Her body was light in his arms, too light, as if the soul that once made her whole had already slipped beyond reach. Villagers gathered, but no one spoke. What words could fill a space that wide? What comfort could touch a wound that deep? They watched as Orpheus placed her gently down and reached for the one thing he had always trusted, his lyre. Music had always been his answer. When storms raged, he played and they softened. When grief haunted others, he played and it turned to memory instead of pain. Surely now, he thought, his music would build a bridge between the living and the dead, a bridge strong enough to call her back. His fingers shook as he set them against the strings. He breathed in, closed his eyes, and struck the first note. It was wrong. The sound rang sharp, thin, empty. He tried again, pressing harder, faster, begging the instrument to obey, but the strings fought him. The melody he sought refused to come. Notes broke under his hands, clashing into something closer to wailing than song. His lyre, once a voice of beauty, had become a mirror of his grief. He pulled at it until his fingers bled, tears falling onto the wood, but still it would not give him what he asked. At last he stopped, chest heaving, heart burning. The crowd stood frozen, afraid to step closer. Orpheus bowed his head, pressing his forehead to the lyre, whispering Eurydice's name like a prayer. The silence after his failed song felt heavier than sound, pressing down on him until he thought he might break. He wanted the music to carry him away, but all it gave him was the reminder that she was gone, gone where no song could reach. And then, without meaning to, his hands found a new rhythm. Not the controlled perfection he had once been known for, but raw, unshaped, a trembling series of chords that fell from his sorrow instead of his skill. They were jagged, uneven, but true. The lyre groaned beneath the weight of his grief, and yet in those fractured sounds something stirred. The crowd wept, the trees seemed to lean closer, the very air grew heavy with mourning. The music had found its key, and the key was loss. Orpheus had not wanted it, had not asked for it, but it was all he had left. Each note he played now carried Eurydice's name, each vibration a plea that the gods themselves could not ignore. His grief was no longer silent. It was song, a song no mortal had ever heard before, the song of a man who had loved so deeply that even death itself felt cruel for taking her. When the final note fell, the world did not clap, it sighed. Orpheus lowered the lyre, tears still falling, and knew that nothing would keep him from her. If the living could not hold Eurydice, then the dead would have to listen. Night had fallen by the time Orpheus reached the river. It was no ordinary stream, but the dark boundary every mortal feared, the place where the living ended and the underworld began. The current moved without sound, black as obsidian, carrying whispers instead of water. It was said no one could cross without leaving something behind, that the river itself fed on finality. Orpheus stood at its edge with his lyre clutched to his chest, his reflection broken by ripples that seemed to mock him. Behind him, the world of the living stretched out, full of fields and festivals, but it no longer belonged to him. Eurydice's absence had carved a hollow so deep that sunlight itself seemed tasteless. Ahead lay shadow, consequence, and perhaps a chance. Mortals had always been told to accept death, to mourn and move on, but Orpheus was no ordinary mortal. His music had bent storms, lulled beasts, swayed gods themselves. How could he now be expected to bow to silence? He knelt at the edge, fingers tracing the cold water. It burned his skin with a chill that seemed to seep into bone, warning him of the cost. He whispered Eurydice's name, and the river stirred, as if it too remembered. His choice was no longer whether to live without her. His choice was whether he dared to follow. The stories told of what waited below. Judges who weighed not gold but truth. Fields where the dead wandered, half remembering who they were. A queen who once ate pomegranate seeds and never returned. A king whose silence was more frightening than any roar. Mortals prayed to avoid that place, but Orpheus found himself longing for it, not because it promised peace, but because it held her. He lifted his lyre and strummed a single note. The sound did not echo. It sank, pulled into the current like an offering. He played again, soft at first, then stronger, each note a plea, each chord a promise. The air thickened. The trees at the riverbank leaned, listening. Even the moon seemed to dim as if to grant him privacy. His song was not for the world this time. It was for the boundary itself, for the line that separated him from what he loved. The river answered, not with words, but with stillness. The current slowed, the surface smoothing until it mirrored him perfectly, as though inviting him forward. Orpheus closed his eyes and made the choice. He would not accept. He would descend. His heart pounded as he stepped into the water, each step colder than the last, as if the world tried to remind him one final time that no man returned once he crossed. He did not care. The gods had taken her, and so he would go where even the gods turned wary. On the bank behind him the grass bent as if bowing farewell. Ahead, the shadows opened, waiting. Orpheus walked into them without hesitation, carrying nothing but his lyre and a love fierce enough to challenge death itself. The river stretched out before him, endless and black, its waters carrying whispers instead of waves. This was the Styx, the boundary no mortal should ever cross, and waiting upon its shore was the ferryman. Charon's figure, was as old as shadow, cloaked in rags that seemed woven from fog itself. His boat creaked at the edge of the water, narrow, skeletal, built not for beauty but for passage. His hand gripped the oar like bone carved into wood, his eyes hollow yet unblinking as he studied Orpheus. No mortal crossed without payment. No soul was carried without coin pressed beneath the tongue or placed in the palm. That was the law, as old as death itself. Orpheus had no coin. He carried nothing but his lyre, the same instrument that had charmed storms and silenced kings. Charon raised his hand, palm open, silent in demand. Orpheus lowered his gaze, then lifted his lyre. If gold could not pay, perhaps sound could. His fingers brushed the strings, tentative at first, testing, then sure, strong. A melody rose that was not for the living or the dead, but for the river itself. It was a song of passage, of doors opening, of footsteps leaving one shore for another. The first note made the water lean, its current bending as though it had paused to listen. The second made the oar in Charon's hand grow heavy, useless, forgotten. By the third, even the whispers of the drowned stilled. The dead who drifted near the banks turned, drawn to the sound as though memory itself had been returned to them. Charon did not breathe, if he ever had, but his body shifted. For the first time in eternity, he lowered his hand without coin. The ferryman stepped aside, gesturing to the boat. The wood moaned as Orpheus set his foot upon it, yet did not break. The river darkened further, as if swallowing the sky whole, but the music kept its balance. Orpheus played still as the boat moved, though Charon never once touched the oar. The water carried them forward, not rowing, not drifting, but obeying. Charon's hollow eyes never left Orpheus. No mortal had paid with sound before. Coins bought silence, bought a simple passage. This, however, was different. This was not payment, it was hope. And hope was the one currency the underworld had not expected. The boat slid across the black waters as if carried by memory itself. Orpheus kept playing, his fingers steady, though his heart was burning. Each note said her name, Eurydice, over and over, until even the shadows seemed to repeat it. When they reached the opposite shore, Charon lifted his hand once more. Not in demand this time, but in acknowledgement. No words were spoken, no thanks offered, yet in that gesture was recognition. Orpheus had crossed the river not with gold, but with a love that had found its sound. He stepped off the boat, the music still ringing, and the shadows of the underworld opened to receive him. The underworld was not fire and torment, as the living often imagined. It was silence, vast and endless, a place where memories dissolved like smoke. Shades drifted through fields of asphodel, their faces blurred, their names forgotten even to themselves. They moved without purpose, without anger, without joy, only the slow shuffle of eternity. Into this silence came Orpheus, mortal yet carrying a sound unlike anything the underworld had known. His lyre gleamed faintly, catching light that was not there, and when his fingers touched the strings, the air itself seemed to tremble. The first notes rose like a spark in the dark. Shades turned their heads, though they had no reason to. They gathered not out of curiosity, but out of something deeper, the echo of what they once had been. Orpheus played not for glory, not for applause, but for them. His music wove images, each chord stitching memory back into shadows. A mother remembered the sound of her child's laugh. A soldier recalled the weight of his sword and the warmth of wine after battle. Lovers, who had wandered side by side without recognition, suddenly saw each other again. For one trembling moment, the dead were alive in the only way left to them, through memory. Orpheus's voice joined the lyre, soft, aching, a melody that rose and fell like breath itself. He sang of sunlight over fields, of laughter shared under olive trees, of names whispered at twilight. He sang Eurydice's name above all others, letting it carry like a prayer through the vastness. The shades pressed closer, their eyes glowing faintly as recognition flickered inside them. They wept though they had no tears, their hands reached though they had no flesh. The song gave them back their humanity, if only for the span of its sound. The underworld listened. Even the air seemed to pause, holding the notes as though unwilling to let them fade. The shades swayed in silence, not a crowd but a congregation, not cheering but remembering. For so long they had been nothing, faceless echoes, and now they felt the weight of who they once were. Some tried to speak their names, their lips moving as if the sound might rise again, but the music carried it for them. Orpheus was their voice, his song, their breath. When the final note fell, the silence returned, heavy and infinite. But it was no longer the same silence. It was filled with the echo of what had been stirred. The shades lingered, their faces fading again, yet slower, as if reluctant. They would forget once more, as all the dead must, but they would remember for a while longer because of him. Orpheus lowered his lyre, his chest heavy with grief, but also with purpose. If his music could wake the dead for even a moment, then perhaps it could move the rulers of this realm. Perhaps it could bring Eurydice back. And so he walked on, deeper into shadow, with a chorus of silent eyes watching him, carrying his song in their silence. The path narrowed into shadow until it ended at a gate carved from stone older than memory. Its bars rose higher than any temple, blackened by centuries of sorrow. Before it lay the guardian all mortals feared to name, Cerberus, the hound of Hades. His body was massive, muscles rippling beneath fur darker than midnight, paws resting on a bed of bone. But it was not his size that froze mortals in terror. It was his heads, 3 of them, each bearing eyes like burning coals, each jaw lined with teeth that could shatter iron. He was Death's sentinel, the beast no army had ever passed. Orpheus stepped forward, his lyre pressed against his chest. His heart pounded, yet his steps did not falter. He knew the stories of warriors who had tried to fight, of kings who had tried to bribe, of fools who had tried to sneak past. All had failed. Cerberus was not fooled by steel or gold. But perhaps, Orpheus thought, there was another way. He lifted his lyre, fingers trembling but sure, and let the first note fall into the silence. The sound was gentle, not a challenge, not a command, but a lullaby. It floated into the cavern like drifting smoke, soft and slow. Cerberus stirred, 3 heads lifting, ears twitching. The left head snarled, teeth flashing white. The middle growled low. The right barked once, sharp as thunder. Orpheus did not stop. His song wove warmth through the cold air, a melody shaped not from defiance but from care. He played as a mother might sing to a child at midnight, as a shepherd might hum to calm frightened sheep. The growl softened, the right head tilted, the middle blinked slowly, the left huffed, restless, but listening. Orpheus closed his eyes, pouring all his grief into the song, letting it become not sorrow but peace. The strings carried memories of hearth fires, of soft earth, of stars watching quietly over sleeping villages. The air grew still. Cerberus lowered one head, then another, then all three. Their eyes dulled, lids heavy. Slowly, impossibly, the hound of Hades lay down, breath deepening into the rhythm of sleep. The ground itself seemed to sigh as the beast settled. His massive chest rose and fell, three heads now lost in the same dream, a dream spun by Orpheus's melody. His teeth unclenched, his paws stretched, and for the first time in ages, the gate behind him stood unguarded, not by force, but by trust. Orpheus stepped lightly, careful not to wake him. Each note guided his steps, each chord smoothed the air, until he stood at the threshold. The gate creaked, not in protest, but in welcome. Orpheus paused only once, glancing back at the sleeping hound. He felt no triumph, only gratitude. He had not conquered Cerberus, he had soothed him, and in that moment he understood what his music was meant to do, not to command, but to calm, not to fight, but to open. He passed through the gate, leaving the beast to dream, and the path to the heart of the underworld unfolded before him. The gate closed behind him with a groan that seemed to stretch through eternity, and suddenly Orpheus was standing in a place that was neither dark nor light. The fields of asphodel stretched out endlessly, a pale meadow where countless souls wandered in silence. It was not torment, but it was not peace either. The dead drifted slowly, their faces blurred by forgetfulness, their steps dragging as if the weight of memory had been taken from them. The air was heavy with the smell of dry earth and faint ash, and though there was no wind, the grass bent as if stirred by invisible hands. Orpheus walked forward, his lyre slung at his side. Every step felt watched, though no eyes turned toward him. The souls moved like shadows, almost human, almost familiar. At first he kept his gaze ahead, but then something caught him. A shape, slender and graceful, moving with a softness that stirred his chest. He stopped, his heart racing, his throat dry. Eurydice. It had to be her. He rushed forward, calling her name, but when the figure turned, it was not her. The face was pale, the eyes vacant, another soul who no longer remembered who they once were. Orpheus froze, the weight of disappointment hitting him like a stone. Again it happened. Another figure, another glimmer of hope, and again it faded into nothing but a wandering shade. Every shadow looked like Eurydice until it didn't. Each time his heart leapt, only to be broken again. He whispered her name into the stillness, but the field gave no answer. The dead kept moving, and the silence pressed harder, as if mocking his desperation. The farther he walked, the more the sorrow grew. His fingers itched for the lyre, and at last he lifted it. The sound was fragile at first, like a flame struggling in the wind, but then it grew. The notes floated across the field, weaving through the shadows. The souls paused, their heads turning slowly as if something long buried had stirred. They listened, and for a moment their faces flickered with recognition. A mother smiled faintly. A soldier's eyes filled with longing. A child laughed, though no sound came. Orpheus played on, his voice breaking into song. He sang of sunlight, of rivers, of mornings when laughter spilled as freely as wine. He sang Eurydice's name over and over, letting it rise like a beacon above the faceless crowd. The souls swayed, pulled by the sound, but none of them were her. Still, he did not stop. His grief became melody. His hope became rhythm. The music carried his longing across the endless meadow until even the flowers of asphodel seemed to bow their pale heads in mourning. When the last note faded, the silence returned, but it was changed. The souls continued drifting, yet slower, as though the song had given them weight again. Orpheus lowered his lyre, his chest aching with emptiness. He had not found Eurydice, but he knew she was here somewhere, hidden among the shadows. And no field, no silence, no absence would keep him from her. At the heart of the underworld stood a hall carved from stone that had never seen the sunday. Its columns rose like towers of bone, its ceiling lost in shadow, and at the far end sat the three judges of the dead. Minos, stern and silent, whose eyes cut through every lie. Rhadamanthus, whose face held no kindness but no cruelty either, only the weight of fairness. Aeacus, older than both, his features carved with patience, as if eternity itself had shaped him. They did not wear crowns of gold or wield sceptres of power. Their throne was judgment, and their only weapon was truth. When Orpheus entered, the silence was heavier than stone. The shades who had followed his song lingered at the edge of the hall, waiting, though they did not know why. The judges studied him, a living man among the dead, carrying nothing but a lyre and a grief too large to hide. Minos spoke first, his voice like a door slamming shut. "Mortal, why do you come here? No living feet are meant to walk these halls." Orpheus did not answer with words. Instead, he lifted his lyre and let his song be his plea. The first note rose, and the hall changed. Shadows softened, the walls seemed to breathe, and the air grew thick with memory. He played not for himself, but for Eurydice, for the vows spoken under olive branches, for the laughter stolen by fate. His voice joined the strings, trembling but unbroken. He sang of love so deep it could not end with death, of a bond too strong for silence. Each chord was a promise, each verse a prayer. The judges listened. Rhadamanthus leaned forward, his hand pressed to his chin, his eyes flickering, as if the music painted pictures only he could see. Aeacus closed his eyes, the faintest sigh escaping his lips, not of pity, but of recognition. Minos, unflinching, watched Orpheus without moving, though the set of his jaw tightened. The song did not beg, it did not flatter, it simply told the truth, a truth raw enough to cut through eternity itself. When the final note faded, the silence was different. Minos spoke again, his voice lower now, not sharp but weighted. "Your song is true. It carries no deceit, no pride. But truth alone does not change law. Rhadamanthus glanced at him, then at Iacchus. The three were bound to rule, yet even they hesitated. Orpheus had not pleaded with arguments, he had pleaded with his soul, and that was something their hammers could not strike against. At last Iacchus opened his eyes and spoke. "This decision is not ours. Your song must be heard by the rulers themselves." The hall seemed to breathe again, shadows retreating, as if the words had stirred something deeper. The judges did not condemn, nor did they release. They simply gestured forward toward the darker halls where Persephone and Hades waited. Orpheus bowed his head, his heart heavy but still burning with hope. His case was not finished. It had only just begun. The deeper Orpheus walked, the colder the air became. It was not the chill of wind or snow, but the kind of cold that lived inside stone, ancient and endless. At the heart of this silence stood the throne room of the underworld, and upon its blackened dais sat Hades, the king who wore silence like armor, and beside him Persephone, the queen who had once been stolen but now reigned with a gaze as sharp as winter. The hall stretched wide and empty, torches burning with flames the colour of ash, their light too dim to reach the corners. Hades sat unmoving, his eyes shadowed, his hand resting on the arm of his throne as if carved there. But Persephone leaned forward, her face pale and luminous, her eyes watching Orpheus with something close to recognition. She knew love when she saw it. She had bargained for it herself when pomegranate seeds had bound her to this place, when longing for her mother's embrace had been weighed against her place at Hades' side. She knew what it meant to have love caught between two worlds. Orpheus did not kneel. Instead, he raised his lyre. His voice rose, soft but sure, the sound trembling with every ounce of grief and hope he carried. He sang of Eurydice, of her laughter under olive branches, of the day the meadow took her away, of the silence that followed. He sang of his journey, each chord a step through darkness, each verse a plea not for glory but for a single chance. The song was not defiance, it was not even prayer. It was love, naked and unguarded, offered like fire in cupped hands. Persephone's eyes softened. The sound reached her in places even winter could not freeze. She remembered the way Demeter had wept when she was taken, how the earth itself had withered for her absence, how seasons had bent to grief. She remembered the first time Hades had looked at her not as a possession, but as a partner. She knew the shape of Orpheus's song, because it was carved from the same longing that had once defined her own. She turned to Hades, her voice quiet but firm. Listen, not as a ruler, not as a god. Listen as one who has loved. Hades' eyes flickered, his face still and unreadable, but he did not refuse. The hall grew heavier, as if the stones themselves bent to hear. Orpheus's music poured into the silence, and for once silence did not resist, it yielded. When the song ended, Persephone's hand rested lightly on Hades' arm. She spoke not as queen but as woman. He does not ask for power, he asks for her. Should we deny what we ourselves have been granted? The question hung in the air, fragile as glass. Hades did not answer immediately. His silence stretched like an ocean, but Persephone's gaze did not waver, and the ice in the room seemed to soften. For the first time since his descent, hope burned warmer in Orpheus's chest. Hades did not move for a long time after the last note faded. His throne seemed more like stone than seat, his presence more like shadow than flesh. The silence stretched until it felt heavier than the walls themselves, and Orpheus stood with his head bowed, gripping his lyre so tightly his knuckles whitened. Persephone's hand still rested lightly on her husband's arm, but even her patience waited on his word. For this was not her realm to command, and though her heart leaned toward mercy, the law of the underworld belonged to him. At last, Hades raised his eyes. They were not blazing, not cruel, but deep and unreadable, the colour of grief buried too long to fade. He looked not at Orpheus first, but at the shades lingering at the edges of the hall, the souls stirred by the song into remembering what they had lost. His gaze lingered on them, then returned to the living man before him. "Your music has weight," he said, his voice low and heavy. "It reminds even gods of things we would rather forget. But the underworld is not built on music. It is built on order." He paused, his fingers curling against the arm of his throne, as if each word cost him something to speak. "Eurydice is here because she belongs to this realm now. She crossed the threshold of death, and law binds her to it. Even love cannot break law without price." His words cut like iron, but there was no venom in them. They were truth, spoken with the weariness of one who had weighed countless pleas and turned them aside. Orpheus lifted his lyre once more, not to play, but to hold it close, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His voice broke into the silence, trembling but unshaken. "If law is stronger than love, then law has forgotten what it was made for." His words echoed, daring but not arrogant, and for a heartbeat even Persephone held her breath. Hades's gaze sharpened, not in anger but in something else, something harder to name. Recognition. The king leaned forward, and his voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "You speak as if you know loss, mortal, but you have not held it for eternity. You have not watched it take root and never leave." He fell silent again, the hall holding its breath, and then he sighed, the sound like stone crumbling. "There is a way," he said at last, "a compromise. She may follow you back to the world above. But there is a condition." His eyes locked onto Orpheus, unblinking, cold, yet alive. "She will walk behind you. You must not look back. Not once, not until you both stand beneath the light of the Sunday. If you turn before then, she will remain here forever." The words echoed like a sentence, and a gift at once. Orpheus's chest tightened, hope and terror crashing together. The bargain was clear, the risk absolute. Behind him, Persephone's gaze softened, but she did not speak. Hades had spoken, and in that moment, the fate of two lovers rested on a single command. Do not look back. The Hall of Thrones faded behind him, its shadows pulling away like a tide. Orpheus stepped carefully, every movement heavier than battle, heavier than any climb he had ever made. His fingers clutched his lyre, but he did not play. The silence was its own song now, broken only by the echo of his footsteps against the stone. Each step carried the weight of a vow, and each breath reminded him of what was at stake. Hades's words still rang in his mind. "She may follow you. do not look back. For a long stretch of path, he heard nothing but his own breathing. The underworld was vast, endless in its stillness, and he dared not hope too soon. His heart hammered, doubt gnawed at him. Had they tricked him? Had the bargain been only shadow and words? And then, faintly, softer than the brush of wind through reeds, he heard it, a whisper, his name, Orpheus. He froze, his throat tight. He wanted to turn, to see her, to throw himself into her arms, but he forced his gaze forward. The whisper came again, stronger this time, and with it the sound of footsteps, light, hesitant, but there. She was behind him, Eurydice. Her presence filled the air like breath after drowning. He could feel her nearness, as if the space between them carried a heartbeat of its own. Tears blurred his vision as he walked, but he kept his head high. His voice cracked as he whispered into the silence. "I hear you. Do not stop. We are almost there." No answer came, but the sound of her steps followed. Each one fell just after his, a rhythm steady and sure. She trusted him, trusted the path, trusted that his music and his love had carried her this far. The fields stretched out, the asphodel swaying without wind, the souls turning to watch. They did not speak, but their faces glowed faintly, as if they too recognized what walked among them. The dead did not often see hope. Tonight they saw it step by step. Orpheus's palms sweated against the strings of his lyre. He longed to play for her, to let the sound wrap around them both, but he feared even the turning of his hands might betray the command. He kept walking, steady, forward, never back. The closer he drew to the edge of the underworld, the heavier the silence became. Each step echoed louder, each pause stretched longer. Behind him, her presence wavered, faint as mist, yet never fading. The whisper of her voice brushed his ears again, tender, trusting, a tether that kept him moving. She was there. Not a shade, not a dream, but Eurydice, his Eurydice. The tunnel ahead brightened, faint light spilling like dawn through a cave mouth. The air changed, warmer, filled with the scent of earth and grass. Orpheus's heart pounded faster. The threshold was near. Daylight waited. So did temptation. He clenched his jaw, fixed his eyes on the light, and whispered again, more to himself than to her, just a little farther. "Do not let me fail you now." The path upward was nothing like the descent. Going down had been a plunge, a tumble into shadow, but climbing back was slow, endless, a stretch of stone that seemed to fold time against itself. The tunnel bent around him, never straight, never kind. His feet dragged, though he did not stop. His breath came sharp, though the air held no wind. Each step forward felt longer than the last, as if the underworld stretched the distance just to test him. Behind him, Eurydice's footsteps whispered faintly, steady but fragile. They kept their rhythm, always a heartbeat after his, always just close enough to remind him she was there. Yet the farther they climbed, the more his doubt grew. What if her steps were only memory? What if the gods had tricked him with echoes, shadows that mimicked what he longed for? His throat burned with the urge to call her name, to turn and make sure she was real. But Hades's warning pressed heavier than stone. She may follow, do not look back. The tunnel curved again and again, the light of the world above still only rumour, faint and teasing. Orpheus's legs ached, his chest heaved, but it was not his body that betrayed him, it was his mind. Doubts swarmed like gnats in summer air. Each silence between her steps seemed longer than it should be. Each sound behind him seemed thinner. He told himself it was enough, the faint rhythm, the whispers he thought he heard. But still, fear whispered louder. What if she had stumbled? What if she was fading? What if the gods demanded more than his patience? He pressed forward, his hand brushing the wall for balance. The stone was cold, rough, and endless. He thought of sunlight, of the day they had wed beneath olive branches, of the meadow that had stolen her away. He thought of her smile, of the way she steadied his hands when he played. He forced the images into his mind like anchors, dragging himself upward with them, step by step. The tunnel bent again, and with it time bent too, stretching so wide it felt as though he had walked for years. The sound of her steps faltered once, softer, slower. His heart leapt into his throat, panic choking him. He clenched his fists and kept moving, whispering to the darkness, "Do not stop, please, keep walking." For a moment he thought he heard her answer, faint as wind through reeds, his name spoken like a prayer. He bit down on the urge to turn. He fixed his gaze on the curve ahead, where light flickered faintly like the edge of a dream. The tunnel seemed endless, a trial carved not in stone but in patience. Orpheus's mind wavered between trust and terror, between faith and failure. The upward path stretched on, bending time like a cruel riddle, but he pressed forward. The sun was still only rumour, but it was enough to keep his feet moving. And behind him, faint but faithful, the rhythm of her steps still followed. The tunnel wound upward, its walls damp with shadows, its air heavy with silence that pressed against Orpheus's back. He walked with his eyes fixed ahead, every step carved from will alone. Behind him came the faint rhythm of Eurydice's steps, light as falling rain, always a beat behind his own. It was the only proof he had that she was there, the only tether holding him to hope. Yet hope was fragile, and in the underworld, even hope was dangerous. A pebble slipped beneath his sandal, skittering across the stone. The sound rang sharp, too loud in the stillness, and his breath caught. For one terrible moment, he thought it might startle her, thought she might stumble, thought the rhythm of her steps might vanish. His chest tightened, his body screamed to turn, to reach out, to see her. His muscles tensed, his neck strained. It would have been so easy, just a glance, just one look to know she was real. But Hades's voice coiled inside him. "Do not look back." The words repeated like a curse, each one heavier than the last. Orpheus swallowed hard, forcing his gaze to stay forward. His hands trembled against the lyre at his side, his knuckles white. The desire was not curiosity, it was need, raw and overwhelming. He had asked for a miracle, begged for her return, and now she walked behind him. Her voice whispered faintly through the dark, his name carried like a breath through reeds. How could he not want to see her? The tunnel bent again, time stretching thin. His breath came fast, ragged. Behind him the sound of her steps faltered once, softer, hesitant. His heart slammed against his ribs, panic flooding him. He wanted to shout, to ask if she was there, to hear her voice clear and certain. His lips parted, but no words came. He remembered the bargain, remembered that even sound could betray him. So he clenched his teeth, swallowing the cry that clawed at his throat. Another pebble shifted, tumbling into darkness. Orpheus's body flinched before his mind could stop it. His shoulders twisted slightly, his neck pulling taut. For a heartbeat, instinct almost won. His mind screamed at him to resist, to hold steady, to keep faith. His fingers strummed the strings of the lyre without thought, not to play a song, but to remind himself of his vow. The vibration steadied him, a thin thread between his will and the edge of breaking. Still, temptation clung to him, stronger with every step. The silence behind her footsteps felt like a question, and questions demanded answers. But answers meant turning, and turning meant losing her forever. He dragged his body forward, sweat damp on his brow, his heart louder than his music. The miracle was walking only a breath behind him, and the cruelest part was knowing that love itself had become the greatest test. The tunnel stretched upward into a pale glow, faint at first, then widening until it spilled across the stone like the edge of dawn. Orpheus squinted against it, his eyes stinging after so long in shadow. It was not yet the sun, but it was close enough to ache. The light bent around the tunnel's curves, promising release, whispering freedom, tempting him with the nearness of everything he had fought for. One more step, he told himself. One more breath. Yet each step grew heavier, as if the underworld itself clung to his ankles, begging him to falter. Behind him came the soft rhythm of Eurydice's feet. The sound was faint, almost lost against the echo of his own, but it was there, steady and real. Her presence brushed against him like warmth he dared not touch. He wanted to turn, to see her face bathed in that first light, to know she was whole, to know this was no trick. But the words of Hades still rang in his skull. Do not look back, not until the sun itself touches you both. The tunnel narrowed as the light grew stronger. Orpheus's chest burned with longing. He could almost smell the air of the living world, green and sweet, touched by earth instead of ash. The memory of olive groves and rivers rushed into him, so vivid he could taste it. His throat tightened. He wanted to share it with her, to look into her eyes and say, "We made it." But faith demanded blindness, and blindness was harder than death. His legs trembled as the slope grew steeper, his hands clutching the lyre not for music but for balance. Every part of him cried out to turn. The sunlight was a hand just beyond reach, and Eurydice was a breath behind him. Together they should have been enough. Yet the silence between her steps felt longer now, stretched thin by the climb. Doubt dug its claws into his mind. What if she had faded again? What if only echoes followed him? What if he had been walking alone all this time? He bit down hard, forcing the thoughts away. The light ahead swelled brighter, and he fixed his eyes on it, refusing to let them stray. His lips moved without sound, shaping her name like a prayer. Eurydice. Eurydice. Each repetition a shield against the gnawing doubt. The tunnel was almost done. Just one more turn, one more step, one more breath of trust. The glow swelled until it filled his vision. His body ached to run, to leap into the light, but he forced himself to keep the pace steady. The almost sun was not enough. He needed the true sun, the full blaze of the living world. Faith demanded patience, and patience, he knew, was the cruelest trial of all. He walked forward blind to everything but the light, praying that love could endure one step longer than his doubt. The tunnel narrowed to a mouth of stone where the light poured in like water. It was not rumour now, but real, warm against Orpheus's skin, golden in a way the underworld could never mimic. His eyes stung, and his chest rose with hope so sharp it hurt. One more step, he told himself, one more step, and she will stand with me in the Sunday. Behind him, he heard the faint sound of her breathing, the whisper of her footsteps brushing against stone. She was there, closer than a shadow, nearer than a prayer. But faith is not the same as certainty. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat shouting questions he could not silence. What if the gods had lied? What if the figure behind him was nothing but an echo? What if she had stumbled and was gone again, and he walked upward alone? The words of Hades rang like iron in his mind. Do not look back, but love is stronger than law, and grief is heavier than commands. A pebble shifted beneath her foot. It was the smallest sound, but to Orpheus it was everything. His body froze, his breath caught, and the doubt surged too high to bear. The light was at his feet now, spilling over the last steps of the tunnel. He needed only to hold steady, only to trust for one heartbeat longer. But his longing was louder than his patience. His neck turned before his mind could stop it, and there she was. Eurydice, her face pale but radiant, her eyes wide with love and sorrow all at once. She reached toward him, lips parting, as if to speak his name, and for that single blink of time, the world was whole. Orpheus saw her not as shadow, not as memory, but alive, following him into the light. Then the law of the underworld struck. Her smile faded, her eyes dimmed, her body grew thin like smoke pulled from fire. Her fingers, stretched toward his, passed through air as though she were already gone. The light did not welcome her, it rejected her. She drifted backward, pulled into the tunnel, her voice trembling on the edge of silence. Orpheus. It was a plea and a farewell in the same breath. He lunged, reaching out, his hand straining against the pull, but it was useless. The underworld had claimed its due. Eurydice's form dissolved, her steps vanished, her voice silenced once more. In the span of a blink, he had found her and lost her twice. Orpheus stood frozen at the threshold, the sunlight burning against his face, his hand empty, his chest hollow. Behind him, the tunnel closed into shadow, and the silence was absolute. He had been granted a miracle, and undone it with a glance. Love had turned his head, and obedience could not save her now. Her name left his lips, but no sound followed, only a rasp torn from his chest as Eurydice's form slipped back into the dark. The tunnel swallowed her the way the sea swallows a stone, without pause, without mercy. Her hand, once reaching, dissolved into air. her eyes dimming like the last ember of a fire left untended. Yet, in the instant before silence reclaimed her, she spoke, not in anger, not in blame, but in something softer. Orpheus. The word fell like a blessing, not a curse. Her voice fragile, yet steady, carrying no reproach. It was not a question, not a cry, but a gift, the last thing she could give him. It echoed once, then again, each repetition fainter than the last, until the sound became more memory than presence. She did not accuse him for failing. She did not weep or rage. She let herself fade like music, ending not with a crash, but with a chord resolving into quiet. Her voice left warmth behind it, the way a candle leaves the faintest glow even after its flame is gone. Orpheus staggered, his body trembling as if struck. He stretched his hand into the darkness, though he knew it was useless. The echo of her voice clung to him, fragile and persistent, but soon even that dimmed. He listened desperately, straining for one more syllable, one more breath. But the underworld gave nothing, only silence, only absence. His knees buckled, and he sank against the cold stone floor, the sunlight just beyond his reach. He had brought her so close to life, closer than any mortal had ever dared, only to lose her again in the length of a heartbeat. Yet the way she had spoken his name stayed with him, a weight and a comfort at once. It had not been goodbye. It had been trust, even as she vanished. The tunnel seemed emptier without her. The silence rang louder than thunder, pressing against his chest. He pressed his forehead to the lyre, whispering her name into its strings, but no note answered. His grief filled the space where her echo had been, but grief was not the same as presence. The gods had been clear. One glance had been enough. And still, she had left him with a word that forgave even as it ended. When he finally rose, his body felt hollow. His eyes burned, but no tears fell. He walked forward into the sunlight, not because he wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. Behind him, the tunnel had already sealed itself in shadow, and Eurydice's voice was now only a memory. Yet it was a memory shaped not by blame, but by love. Even as she was pulled back into silence, she had given him that gift. Her final word was not punishment, but a benediction, and though the sound was gone, its echo lingered in him, softer than breath, quieter than sorrow, eternal as love itself. The sun broke across his face as he stepped out of the tunnel, warm and golden, spilling over his skin like a blessing that no longer mattered. Orpheus blinked against the brightness, his eyes stinging after so long in shadow. Birds called faintly from the trees above, the wind stirred the grass, and somewhere nearby a stream murmured over stone. The world was alive, rich with sound and scent, but he carried none of it within him. His hands shook at his sides, trembling with a grief too sharp to still. He had climbed through darkness, sung to kings, calmed the hound of Hades, and reached the edge of life itself. And yet he stood alone. Eurydice had not followed him into the light. The meadow where he now stood looked like every field he had ever known, but it felt empty, as if the earth itself sensed the absence walking beside him. Orpheus sank to his knees, pressing his palms into the soil as though he might feel her through it. All he felt was the cool dampness of grass and dirt. The underworld had closed its hand around her, and there was nothing he could do to pry it open again. His lyre hung at his side, silent, until his trembling fingers lifted it. He had carried it through shadow, through silence, through sorrow, and now it felt heavier than ever. He touched the strings, and the sound that came was different, deeper, fuller, as though the instrument itself had learned grief with him. The notes rose fragile at first, but soon they grew into something more. They trembled and cracked, yet they carried a truth too sharp to ignore. The lyre understood him now. It sang of loss not as an end, but as a wound that never closed. He played with shaking hands, each chord breaking him open, each vibration filling the meadow with sorrow. Birds quieted, wind stilled, even the stream seemed to hush. The music poured out of him like blood, unstoppable, raw. He sang her name again and again, not demanding, not pleading, only remembering, Eurydice. Each syllable was a prayer, each note a fragment of love, shattered and reshaped by grief. The world listened. Trees bent softly, the grass swayed without breeze. Even the sky seemed to dim as though it mourned with him. His song was no longer the music that tamed storms or calmed beasts. It was something greater and smaller at once. It was the sound of a man who had walked through death and returned without the one he loved. When the last note faded, the silence was unbearable. Orpheus lowered the lyre, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold it. He bowed his head, his breath ragged, his heart raw. He had returned, but without return. The world was bright, but it no longer glowed. The sun touched him, but he no longer felt its warmth. And in the quiet that followed, he knew that though he lived, part of him had been left behind, sealed forever in the shadow where Eurydice still walked. The days after his return stretched long and hollow. Orpheus wandered through hills and valleys, his lyre always at his side, his heart heavy with the weight of a silence that refused to leave him. He could no longer speak to people, for their voices reminded him of what he had lost. Instead, he turned to the world itself. If mortals could not give him comfort, perhaps the earth, the sky, or the seas might answer. He began to play for the trees, and they listened. His notes curled through their branches, and the leaves shivered in reply. Whole groves bent toward him, as if his sorrow had become the wind itself. He sang Eurydice's name, and the bark trembled, but no voice answered back. When he turned to the stones, they too responded. His music sank into the earth, and rocks split, not with force, but with grief. Boulders cracked and shifted, rolling aside as though even stone could not bear to resist the sound of his mourning. He sang her name into the chasms, and the echoes carried it far. But the echoes were only his own voice thrown back at him. The earth could hear, but it could not give him what he sought. Storms came, and he played for them as well. Clouds thickened above him, thunder rolled in his chords, lightning seemed to flash in time with his strings. Rain poured when his voice broke, soft and endless, until whole fields flooded with his sorrow. Even the storms bowed to his song, their violence softened into weeping, their fury undone by melody. Yet, when the skies cleared, he was still alone. The heavens gave him silence where he begged for a reply. Orpheus played on, each song deeper, louder, heavier with longing. His music could bend the world, move what was immovable, soothe what was wild, but it could not pierce the boundary he most wanted to cross. Trees, stones, and storms listened faithfully. They bent and broke and wept at his command, but none of them could bring Eurydice back. Every song ended the same way, with silence that swallowed him whole, silence that reminded him of the one place his music had failed. The people who heard him whispered that he had become more than mortal, that even nature itself obeyed him. They gathered to watch from a distance, as forests leaned, rivers slowed, and winds grew still beneath his voice. But Orpheus never looked at them. Their awe meant nothing. He wanted only one listener, the one who was gone. Night after night, he sang beneath the stars, his hands blistered from playing, his throat raw from calling her name. The constellations wheeled above him, patient and cold, and even they seemed to tremble with his grief. But still no answer came, no hand touched his shoulder, no voice whispered back. His songs could change weather, could break the silence of the world, but they could not mend the silence inside him, and so he sang, endlessly, until even his sorrow became the sky's sorrow, and still he was alone. Whispers followed him wherever he went. Some said Orpheus had walked through death itself and returned. Others claimed he had looked upon the queen and king of the underworld and lived to sing about it. But the story that clung to him most was the one of his devotion. He had loved Eurydice so fiercely that no woman after her could reach him. At first, that love was admired. Villagers spoke of it with awe, poets wove it into verse, lovers pressed the story against their own hearts, as if it were a charm. He had become a symbol of loyalty, of a love unbroken even by death. Yet, symbols are fragile things. Over time, admiration turned into unease. Women who once smiled at him now frowned. They offered him their hands, their laughter, their promises of warmth, but he refused each one. Not cruelly, not dismissively, but with silence that felt heavier than rejection. His devotion, once beautiful, began to look like defiance. They whispered that it was unnatural, that a man who could turn away from life for the sake of the dead was no man at all, but something cursed. The offers dwindled, and in their absence, rumour grew sharper. He wandered alone through villages, playing his lyre, his music carrying the same grief that haunted him. Children listened wide-eyed, elders shook their heads, and women turned away, wounded by his refusal to see them. His devotion became less a story of love and more a story of stubbornness. People spoke his name with pity, then with fear. Some said the gods themselves had twisted him, that no mortal should resist life so completely. His songs, once a comfort, began to sound dangerous, too deep, too sorrowful, as if they carried the weight of another world. The loneliness sharpened around him like a blade. Fields bent to his music, rivers paused for him, storms softened, but no human hand reached for his. He had closed himself off, wrapped in a devotion that no one could touch. Isolation became his companion, and in the silence of his wandering, danger began to follow. Bands of women, angered by his rejections, whispered among themselves. Some pitied him, others despised him. To them, His loyalty to Eurydice was no longer noble. It was an insult, a wound that spread through their pride. The danger was not immediate, not sudden, but it grew like ivy climbing stone. His devotion, unshaken, turned from blessing to curse in the eyes of those who longed for his attention and never received it. What had once made him a legend began to isolate him from the world he had fought so hard to return to. And though he sang with the same devotion, though his song still reached the trees and the stars, Orpheus was now a man watched by shadows. The price of refusing new love was not only loneliness, it was the slow, certain turn of admiration into resentment, the quiet sharpening of rumor into something darker that waited at the edge of every song. There came a night when even the stars seemed tired of listening. Orpheus sat on a hilltop where the grass bent in the wind and the horizon glowed faintly with the memory of a vanished Sunday. His lyre lay across his knees, strings worn from years of playing, wood darkened by the touch of sorrowful hands. He plucked once, twice, and the sound that answered was thin, fragile, like a bird whose wings had forgotten the sky. For the first time since Eurydice's death, the music did not comfort him. It echoed hollowly, reminding him not of her presence, but of her absence. He lowered the lyre and let the silence swell. His voice rose instead, raw, unaccompanied, a sound both broken and beautiful. It trembled across the empty fields, carrying the same grief that had followed him since the meadow took her away. His song was no longer meant for the living, nor for the gods. It was for her alone. Some say the trees leaned closer, that their leaves shivered as if trying to catch every note before it vanished. Others claim the stars themselves dimmed, listening as his voice reached upward. He sang until the ground seemed to pulse beneath him, until even the wind refused to interrupt. When his final note faded, the lyre slid from his lap and rested against the earth. Orpheus did not reach for it again. The strings were still, the frame silent. His voice had gone where hers had gone, and he felt it leave him as if it had always belonged elsewhere. Some said his song became part of the night sky, woven into the constellations, so that lovers gazing upward might hear fragments of his grief in the hush between stars. Others whispered that his voice seeped downward into the soil, feeding roots and rivers, carried into the veins of the world itself, so that every sprout of green, every rush of water remembered him. The truth was simpler. He stopped singing. His lips pressed together, his chest hollowed, and silence became his companion. Those who had once feared his devotion now wondered if he had finally given it up, but they were wrong. He had not abandoned his love. He had followed it. If music was the bridge he built between himself and Eurydice, then he had walked it one final time, and there was no reason to return. The lyre rested by his side, an empty shell of the songs it once carried. Travellers who passed that hill swore they found it abandoned, strings snapped as though unstrung by invisible hands. They whispered that Orpheus no longer needed an instrument, no longer needed breath or voice, because he had become the silence that follows music, the quiet that lingers after the final chord. Some believed he had walked into the woods and dissolved into roots and streams. Others swore they saw his shadow rise into the night sky, dissolving into constellations. But all agreed on one thing. Orpheus's song was not lost. It was simply no longer his. It had gone to where Eurydice waited, and the world was left with silence heavy enough to remember. They say the underworld holds many rivers, each carrying its own kind of silence. Some wash away memory, others lull the dead into dreamless rest. But there is one place where two rivers meet, their currents tangled in a soft, unending embrace. It is there, the old storytellers whisper, that Orpheus and Eurydice walk together again. No bargains, no rules, no gods to dictate the pace of their footsteps. Just two shadows whose hands finally find each other and never let go. Their reunion was not marked by thunder or prophecy. It came quietly, like a dawn that does not rise but glows from within the dark. Eurydice, who once slipped away in a meadow, steps lightly across the waters, her figure more whole than it had ever been in life. Orpheus, who once sang the world into tears, does not carry a lyre now. He carries silence, but it is no longer empty, it is full of her. When their eyes meet, the years of grief fall away like ash in wind. He does not need to sing, she does not need to call his name. They are already home. Above the earth, mortals still tell their story. Lovers whisper it at night when the fire burns low. Musicians pluck soft strings and swear they hear his hand guiding theirs. Poets write verses about a boy who sang the gods into mercy, and a girl whose absence shaped the greatest song of all. Every true love song, they say, is only an echo of Orpheus and Eurydice, a borrowing of their refrain. When the world feels too heavy, when love feels too fragile, people remember them. Two souls who endured every loss the fates could design, and still found each other again. Some claim you can hear them if you walk alone by a river at night. The water might shift against the stones, shaping itself into a melody too faint to repeat. Some hear Eurydice's laughter caught in the rush of a stream. Others hear Orpheus's voice in the low hum of the current. The rivers carry them not as tragedy, but as memory, as if the world itself refuses to let their love be forgotten. The gods, silent now, no longer intervene. Perhaps they learn something too, that even laws and punishments cannot sever what is bound deeper than bone, deeper than soul. The underworld may demand silence, but love bends silence into song, and song bends loss into promise. So the story does not end with death, nor with grief, nor even with the breaking of rules. It ends where it began, with music, with laughter, with two hands finding each other under an endless sky. Orpheus and Eurydice walk together beyond the reach of gods and mortals alike, carried always by two rivers that became one current. And above, on the lips of every singer and in the heart of every lover, their refrain remains, reminding the world that love, no matter how tested, no matter how torn, always finds a way to return.